Okay, you can give it like a beat of silence, and then we'll get started. Maybe.
Uh-huh.
Hey everybody, it's another episode of Metric, the User Experience Podcast. I'm Michael.
I'm Amanda.
And this month we are finally able to announce that our second ever LibUX community webinar has been scheduled with Amanda. We've got it set for March 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Title and blurb pending, but our first webinar was such a success that we think we're going to make it a monthly thing. So stay tuned to Metric Podcast on Twitter or our individual accounts, and we will totally hook you up. It is free for the community. There are 100 seats limited, and we pushed it up to 97 last time. So once you see that RSVP link go out, be sure to take advantage of it.
Thank you. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Asana during this webinar, which is the project management tool that I started using a few months ago when I became the publicity manager, and I realized, oh God, there's a lot of things I got to track.
I don't really manage my projects well. I need help.
Yeah, me too. All right, so back in February, you wrote about something you had just discovered.
Yeah, so I am working on a Code for Lib article with Cynthia Ng, who is one of our first podcast guests ever. 2 or 3 years ago, she joined us to talk about accessibility, and she's sort of a go-to accessibility person. So we're writing an article together. And yeah, just as I was digging up topics, or I was digging for some sort of research, I can't really remember how I went down this rabbit hole. I learned about the accessibility tree, which sounds like it would make a really interesting, if not incredibly boring, children's book. But there's this thing. It's called the accessibility tree, and if you didn't think your grip on web accessibility could get any looser, I introduced to you this brand new to me aspect of web accessibility that just continues to complicate things.
Yeah, like I thought I had an idea what it meant, especially with is it pronounced ARIA? A-R-I-A?
Yeah, ARIA. I don't think I've heard many people actually use it in person, you know?
Yeah, so I kind of was like, oh, okay, I think I get a vague idea of what the accessibility tree is, but then when I started reading after reading your little short article about it, I got even more confused.
If you think about what you see in the browser, there are a few things going on. The main thing is that underlying what you see, underlying the look and feel, is I'm trying to phrase this for people who aren't developers, right? Because that's a kind of a huge contingent of our listenership. So, butt in if I no longer make sense. But underneath the look and feel of a website, there is kind of an an XML tree structure that the browser itself, whether Chrome or Firefox or whatever, interfaces with. These are the nodes that various HTML APIs connect to, and it's called the Document Object Model, or the DOM. When you are those of you who've ever dabbled with jQuery, where you might say, "Hey, get this button, turn it blue." That's a kind of JavaScript that some people call DOM scripting. You are changing something specifically in the DOM, in this tree. In this case, you are taking what the browser or what the server rendered, which was, say, a red button, and you are changing it on the client side. So you're changing the DOM. What the user sees is, the look and the feel, the visual, like everything. But underneath that, there is kind of like a skeletal structure, and that's kind of what we're talking about. Are you with me so far?
Yes, so stuff like headers, or if this is like a video embedded in here, those are different DOM things which can be manipulated.
DOM elements, right. Everything is in there. And in fact, it's not viewing source, but in most modern browsers, if you right-click or control-click, you'll see an option to inspect element, and that will bring up the DOM. You'll see, here's the body, and inside the body is an H1 and some links and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mostly use that for CSS purposes.
Yeah, exactly. So CSS attaches. It looks for these like DOM selectors. That said, there's also a CSS tree, but maybe that's a different topic.
Yeah.
So here we are. I have this understanding of the DOM. I have enough of an understanding of like web accessibility that I at least feel confident enough to tackle it in an article. So the way I assumed things were working was that, let's say that you have a screen reader, and this is your main way for interfacing with web content. Basically, what I understood was that a screen reader would kind of traverse the DOM and be like, here's the body, and here's a heading, and it would find things in it and read it out to you. So that's why in accessibility, kind of like best practices, your document structure, your content structure, your source order matters, right? So basically, if you have a traditional website where you have main content and a sidebar, the source order of that sidebar means that in the code it falls underneath all of the main content. So, and that's because in the DOM there's no left or right; it's just top to bottom. So a screen reader would it hit all the bones from the skull to the feet and get everything in that order. Okay, so this is my understanding. I'm like, great. Yeah. Apparently it's wrong.
So, yeah, because some of this sounds like with what HTML5 came in with, where you start having to have like article versus aside sort of things. Is that related?
Yeah, sort of. What HTML5 elements allowed for was that the DOM would have some meaning. So I guess you can imagine that if you don't need a screen reader, if you were just looking at the code with your eyes, a few years ago, everything's sort of meaningless, right? It's a div and a div and a div and maybe a table and a div and a div and a div. And so at a glance, unless you were actually reading the content, whatever's between the paragraph tags, there's nothing about the code itself that suggests the purpose of that code unless you're the one who wrote it. So what HTML5 introduced were these semantic elements like header, article, aside, section, for kind of the explicit purpose that, if you are looking at just the code, it tells you something about what that chunk of code does. This is the header. Great. I kind of understand that. This is an article. Awesome. I got that. The same thing would be true for a screen reader or for any kind of machine parsing, right? So Google crawlers, not to underestimate the power of our future overlords, they, if there weren't these semantic elements, it's hard for even a little bot to glean any kind of context from the website, because all it's looking at is the DOM. It's not looking at, it doesn't see or perceive the layout of the web page the way we do. So HTML5 semantic elements kind of helped this. These are laden with ARIA rules or semantic meaning, so the screen reader would be like, this is the main content of the article. That suddenly makes a screen reader's job so much easier than it had been like years prior. But so this is what I'm thinking. I'm like, so a screen reader or other assistive technology would look through the DOM. Da 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 da. Great. But apparently that's not as simple as that, and that's where I kind of bumped into this reality that there is an accessibility tree, and TLDR, the best way that I can summarize this is that there is a DOM, a document object model, and there is almost an exact clone of it called the accessibility tree. Kind of the same thing. An accessibility tree being like, again, just a node structure, top to bottom, of the DOM, sort of, but they're slightly different, and the screen reader, let's talk best case scenario right now. The screen reader actually interfaces with the accessibility tree instead of the DOM, which right there introduces a little bit of complexity that if you change something in the DOM that doesn't get changed in the accessibility tree, it's not going to be communicated to the screen reader.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like, so far in your research, has it told you, like, how you're supposed to do this, like when you're coding?
Yeah, sort of. So, like I said, this is all with the caveat that I just learned about this less than a month ago, and I've been going down a little bit of a deep dive, but it's a new concept to me that is not a new concept to a lot of other smarter people out there. So this is my take. But yeah, that's what like using ARIA roles and other kind of like assistive code do. So if you're
already using ARIA, you don't really have to get too concerned that you're accidentally damaging the accessibility tree because you're already working on that when you do your ARIA stuff.
No, actually, so if you're using ARIA, you are. Let me see if I can phrase this in a simple way. When the browser renders, if you didn't do anything, you used some. Okay, here we go. You didn't even use any HTML5 elements. Everything's a div or an H1 or a paragraph tag, but you're not using section or article or main or anything like that. When the browser renders that DOM, the accessibility tree is like a carbon copy of it. Bam, bam. It's just kind of it's a clone. Now, you introduce some HTML5 elements that have this semantic meaning, header, etc., header footer. What you're doing, so when the browser renders these things, now before the accessibility tree is created, there's a couple of little guiding structures. Like if you're thinking of like a literal tree, there might be that pole in the ground that the tree is tied to help guide it up. So there's a little bit of a guide for that accessibility tree. So it suddenly is aware of header and footer, and then the rest is a clone. Mm-hmm. The more ARIA roles that you use, the more of a blueprint or skeleton for the accessibility tree there is. So if you are using you're using buttons and div role equals content info, and you're doing all these things, suddenly before the accessibility tree builds, there is it has a little bit more of a guideline to it. So when you're deliberately using ARIA roles, you're building this accessibility tree. And there are actually inspector elements that let you see it. But the idea is that, you are actually instructing the browser to create the interface that assistive technology makes for you. And that's cool. That gives you a lot of power. The caveat is that now as sites get increasingly more dynamic, or like, even just little things, you have a pop-up or you have an inline form submission. So let's say somebody fills out a form and they hit submit, rather than refreshing the page to a thank you page or something, it just, the button grows a little bit, has a little bit of a spinner, and then it turns green with a check mark and it says saved. Great, you're done. That kind of what's happening there in the DOM may not be translated to the accessibility tree. So,
Yeah.
or vice versa. Like you can actually impact the accessibility tree without making any changes in the DOM. And so what it does is just increase the complexity of all this kind of development and design.
So if I can kind of take it with our new website, which is built using Laravel,
Right.
all my page content is actually Markdown. So, it's nothing more complicated than being like, this is a header and this is a link. Do you have any thoughts or know anything about how the accessibility tree and Markdown works together?
Yes. So Markdown is a pre-server language. So the benefit of Markdown is that it could be basically a text document where you have, say, like a hashtag or an underline of some text means that's a heading. Like that's H1, or two hashtags, that's H2. And if you imagine just opening up a bunch of text in your stock notepad that doesn't have any kind of code in it or whatever, Markdown kind of helps lay that out. And what happens in Laravel is that when Laravel builds, I think it's called like the artisan build process or whatever, but when it renders to the browser, it's actually rendering in HTML. So if you inspect the DOM, that hashtag my heading would be an H1 properly marked up. The caveat is depending on the template that it's building, it may be lacking those other semantic elements. So you could have an article where, H1, my article, and then inside the main content of the article is in a section, and that might be relevant to you for whatever reason. So HTML rendered by Markdown that becomes HTML might actually lack any of that more specific semantic meaning.
Yeah.
But shouldn't. Yeah, but it would basically be. It creates a DOM, and it shouldn't affect the accessibility of anything.
Yeah, because I remember on our old Drupal site, I went into the templates and I changed all the images to have proper figure and caption. But without going and digging into my library's website at this second, I'm not sure if that got translated over.
Well, so that's a good thing. That's a good thing to point out. Yeah, because images in Markdown I kind of forget how they're done because I don't do them often, but it's something like bracket, but there is a Markdown way to give them alt text. But yeah, if you don't do that, it's not going to render any alternative text.
Yeah. Oh, cool. So I think what we're getting at here in this little episode is, if anybody's an expert on the accessibility tree, you should come talk with us.
Yeah, this is kind of fascinating. Some other stuff I kind of ran across while I was going down this rabbit hole was that. So there's this accessibility tree, and okay, great. So what that means is that anytime something changes dynamically on the page, the implication is that you would have to use ARIA roles or something to actually signal that change to the accessibility tree. So what you're actually it's just a way to kind of visualize how you're interacting with that assistive technology. So rather than you're not actually sending signals to the screen reader itself, you're sending signals to an accessibility tree that the screen reader parses. So it's kind of like a helpful way to visualize what's happening. Now, what I learned was that not all assistive technology even uses the assistive technology, or even uses the accessibility tree. Some do. Some use both that and the DOM. Some use just the DOM. So as increasingly complicated the picture of web accessibility gets, it's not the assistive technology doesn't use it in a standard way either. So, yeah.
So I have a slight tangent.
Please.
If I'm not mistaken, I read that the University of Stanford or Berkeley is getting ready to take down all of their MOOC content because they got sued for it not being accessible.
Ooh.
Yeah, so that's like 20,000 items they're going to be taking offline, and they're going to put it behind their student paywall because I believe the Department of Justice had told them that, hey, you have to make this accessible if you're going to offer it at all. So I've been wondering, is this going to be like the death knell of MOOCs? Because, I mean...
You know what it sounds like? It sounds like it's a big warning to all those different course platforms. It's not just the MOOCs. I meant like Blackboard is pretty inaccessible, and I don't know about some of the others like Canvas or other course management systems, but I think we can all just feel as complicated as they are for sighted users to use. This is a big warning sign, and educational institutions are major culprits here. So good for Berkeley, but bad for everybody else. And those platforms have to be updated, or else.
Yep. So in other words, the accessibility thing is not something you can do the bare minimum on, since I imagine most libraries would not be sued, but maybe big universities might get in trouble.
No way. I think maybe practically it's probably not worth an individual library getting sued, but they are susceptible. And since if you can think of an academic library, it really represents the bulk of the content that students interface with. Like a university website has a ton of pages, right? But most of that content is probably, I'm just guessing, if it's not on Blackboard, it's like the actual courses. The static content is probably like library content. So now there are certain stipulations where, there are either loopholes, or you're not 100% legally obligated to do X, Y, Z, but it's increasingly going to become an issue the more awareness there is. And it's only increasingly common. I think this is going to be the trend, the accessibility trend to watch. Not that, oh, look how many people are jumping on the bandwagon and building for assistive technology, etc., and universal design. It's, oh, look how many people have to suddenly retrofit their entire application stack because they are at risk of getting sued.
Yep.
Watch for this in the news.
Yes. All right, so I look forward to reading yours and Cynthia's joint article on this.
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't mislead absolutely everybody. That's the one thing. It's like, as I was writing this, I just learned about how much I didn't know, like the accessibility tree. So it's an increasingly complicated landscape. I think ARIA support is at best like 70% in old Internet Explorer with JAWS, and every other combination of screen reader and browser is less than that. So, it's a humbling thing to get into. Not just to mention that, what you learn from the accessibility tree is no matter what you do, it's not going to be universally effective. It's not. You can make something look more or less the same in every browser, but you can't make assistive technology do anything remotely similar.
Side quick. God, I can't remember what it's called, but when you're doing like CSS where you'd have all these prefixes in for different browsers,
Yeah.
is there something like this for accessibility?
So not so CSS does have an impact on this tree. This is kind of where it's a little outside of my expertise, but making anything like display hidden or display block or sorry, display none, display block, visual, hidden, etc. Will remove or add something to the accessibility tree, right? So there's not really any way to target a screen reader because the screen reader is usually like software over the browser. So you can kind of target a browser, but that's increasingly difficult as well because, but the screen reader isn't part of the browser. It's something that is on top of it in a way. So no, it's really hard it's really hard to target a specific screen reader. Like you can't say like, oh, I know that JAWS renders this in one way, but it's not so useful in Mac VoiceOver. So for VoiceOver, I want to do this. To my understanding, there's no way that you can do special rules for different screen readers. Like in the old days, you could do that for Internet Explorer. Like, oh, if you're IE8, do this. If you're IE9, do that. But no, I think it would be useful. It'd give us a lot more control, but I think that would just, I don't know, fragment things more. The goal, of course, is to get everyone on board with the web accessibility guidelines from the W3C, and otherwise, if I don't know. It's hard to hold screen reader companies accountable because I don't think they have crazy huge staff, and what they're doing is really hard, and browsers update constantly, and it's so I think they earn sympathy and understanding. It is a difficult thing that we're all trying to do, and the folks who are behind the tooling have a huge hill to climb.
Yep. All right. Well, it was good talking with you again, Michael, and I look forward to the article.
All right, Amanda. Thanks a bunch. Thank you, everybody who tuned in for this episode. We'll see you next Monday with some other topic.
Bye.
Bye.